Thanks for coming. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Sable. I'm actually the retired executive director, but our new executive director is out of town this week, so I'm filling in. On behalf of Dale Mosier, our board chair, and the entire Vail Symposium board, we're very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program. The symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programming to the Vail community since 1971. We're a nonprofit organization. Ticket sales cover about 15% of our operating costs. So donors at every level help make a difference so that we can meet our mission of providing almost 40 programs a year with wonderful speakers on great topics. I'd like to thank some of the individuals and organizations who help make this possible. Our presenting sponsors is the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Our Hot Topic series is underwritten by Kathy and Neil Kimmel, and our geopolitical series is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls. I'd like to also recognize the many Lighthouse members that are here in attendance tonight. Let's give all of our donors a big round of applause. And if you're not already a donor and would like to figure out how you can also help support, you can reach out to me, you can call our office line and leave a message, or you can reach out to James Kenley. So tonight we turn our attention to Ukraine. When I was recognizing the donors, you may have noticed that I said I recognize both the Hot Topics and the geopolitical series underwriters. And the reason for that is this program fits into both of those categories. Certainly it's a hot topic, has been in the news 24/7 for over a year now, and we can't get away from it if we wanted to, and I think we're all very interested. And geopolitically, it's going to be an important issue for us, not only today, but into the future. We don't really know, and won't know for some time, the overall effects of this war and its impacts on democracy in the world, the makeup of NATO, our international relations with countries like China, Russia, and many other countries. So when we put together these programs and we start developing them 6 to 12 months out, we never know what's that program going to be like when we actually get to presenting it. Sometimes it's really a hot topic like tonight. Sometimes it's yesterday's news. Doesn't happen very often, but we're usually, I would say somewhat lucky, but also we're very thoughtful in our choices. So tonight I think that this program is probably more relevant than we chose it 9 months ago to talk about it. And to lead the discussion, we're honored to welcome Ambassador William B. Taylor. Now I could review his resume, but that would take the rest of the evening, so I'm going to just do some highlights. Ambassador Taylor is Vice President, Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He's a West Point and Harvard University Kennedy School government graduate. He served as an infantry patrol leader and combat company commander to the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. And he has served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. Final reminder, there will be time for questions at the end. I'll bring a microphone around. And now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador William B. Taylor.
Chris, please. Thank you. Very good. Is this working now? Is this on? All right. So this works now, right? Okay, yeah. It does. Very good. Chris, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I'm honored to be here. I understand, I've learned that this is the 51st year of the Vail Symposium. Anything that goes on that long must be worthwhile, must have a solid tradition. And I'm just honored to be the latest part of that. As Chris said, I'm going to talk about Ukraine this evening. I've done other things in my career. This is both my time in Ukraine and working on this issue has really been the highlight, really, of my career. I'm devoted to making this work, as you will see when we have this conversation. I do want it to be a conversation. I will talk for some period of time, hopefully not too long, because I would really like to have your questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, disagreements, challenges. This would be just very welcome. So I would do this. So I'll talk a little bit about this, but let me just, in general, what I'm going to talk about is how we got here, where we are now, and that's kind of what this map shows, where we are now. Where are we going? Where do we think this might end? Where is it headed? And then finally, I will end on why I think it matters. And this is, again, what I would love to get your thoughts on. Why does it matter to people here in Vail? Why does it matter to people in Colorado? Why does it matter to the United States what happens in Ukraine? And I think this is important. So this is an opportunity for me to make that case, and I'd love to get your thoughts. I'm also told I can't move, and I'm not allowed to walk around the stage here. I have to stay planted, so which is uncomfortable. But I will try to do my duty of this. How did we get here? So we could go way back. I'm only going to go back to 2014. 2014 is when the Russians first invaded Ukraine. And they invaded Ukraine, took me, a lot of us by surprise, and they invaded Crimea, this little peninsula off of Ukraine here. Part of Ukraine, let's be clear, is where in 2014 the Russians first invaded. Then, when they didn't get a whole lot of pushback, and a lot of resistance, they also invaded what we call Donbass, and that's Donetsk and Luhansk. Probably can't read these words, but that's this little area here. So these two, this is where it started in 2014. The Russians invaded. I said we were surprised. We were surprised. This invasion by the Russians of Ukraine was the first time since the Nazis invaded in World War II another country. So from World War II until 2014, so some 69 years, there had been an understanding, there had been a recognition by nations that other nations, neighboring nations, other nations were sovereign, and their borders were not to be violated. They had territorial integrity, that peaceful resolution of disputes. Those principles helped Europe develop, helped the United States develop, were good for our security, good for our well-being, it turns out it was good for the world, this period of time after World War II, up until, again, the Russians invaded. There were problems, let's be clear. I mean, we all remember some of but there weren't major wars during it. There were minor wars. And as Chris said, I participated in a couple of these. Other people in this room did as well. But there weren't wars between major powers in Europe. And that was a major accomplishment of that period of time, that order. We're going to come back to that notion, that concept of why that was important. But this was the first time, this Russian invasion was the first time since 1945 that one nation had violated the borders and invaded another in order to take territory, in order to claim part of Ukraine, in this case, in both Crimea and Donbass. So that's where it started. And the Ukrainians were caught by surprise. The president, I want to move here, but I'm told not to do this, so I'll stay right here. The Ukrainians were, the president of Ukraine at the time, in 2014, was freely elected in 2010, but he was very pro-Russian. He was very pro-Russian. His name was Yanukovych, and he had allowed the Ukrainian military essentially to degrade, to hollow out corruption and other problems. So when the Russians invaded, first in Ukraine and then in Donbass, the Ukrainian military was not in a position to resist. The international community, the United States, NATO, the UN was not in a position to take any strong action either. We were, again, surprised, couldn't believe what was happening. It was happening. We eventually put on some kind of mild sanctions. We identified the people responsible for this invasion in Russia, sanctioned them, but this was under, again, President Obama, and that changed his attitude towards Russia. But there was not a big response. There was not a major response, certainly not a military response. What did happen was some additional training and additional military assistance from the United States and other NATO nations to Ukraine to help them resist. Because the Russians, again, in 2014, just had this part and this part of all of Ukraine. But it was a real war. It was low-level fighting. 14,000 Ukrainians died between 2014 and 2019. So there was real conflict, in particular in this area here, real conflict that went on. 2019, a new president is elected in Ukraine. His name is Volodymyr Zelensky. President Zelensky, before being elected president, was an entertainer. He had never held office before. He'd never been in the government, never been in the military. He was a pretty successful businessman. His company did very well. He was the lead producer. He was the lead writer, the lead actor, and did some stand-up comedy. He had a TV series called Servant of the People, and in which Volodymyr Zelensky plays in this series, you know this, you've seen this, the president of Ukraine. You know, he plays the president of Ukraine in the TV, in the series. Let me ask a question. So how many people in this room have been to Ukraine? Okay, all right, very good. About 6 or 8. This is good, all right. This is going to be, I'm going to come back to that as well. So President Zelensky, with no real experience in the government, is elected in 2019. I had been the ambassador in Ukraine earlier, much earlier, in 2006, 2009, as Chris just said, and then was back as kind of acting ambassador when Zelensky was just inaugurated. He just went into office, and I got there about that same time. So I had an opportunity to meet him on many occasions in that fall of 2019. He came into office, similar kinds of things that he said on his TV show. I mean, he was elected in the TV show to go after corruption, to go after oligarchs. He knew that they were dragging the country down, that corruption and corrupt oligarchs was a problem. And in his TV show, he went after them. And he was elected overwhelmingly. 73% in a free and fair election. He won that election in 2019. So he comes into office, no prior experience, a lot of energy. He's clearly very smart. He's idealistic to the point, I would even say, of naivete. He thought, for example, he ran on two planks in his platform. First, end the war, which again had been going on since 2014, so it had been going on for 5 years. And he thought, this is an example of kind of his naivete almost, certain idealism maybe. He thought that if he could just sit down with President Putin, if he could just get a meeting with this man, he would sit down and have a conversation with him, and they could work it out. And he could get the Russians to leave his country, and you know, they could work something out. Well, that didn't happen. It turns out President Putin was not much interested in meeting with President Zelensky. The second plank of his platform was anti-corruption. So those are the two things that he came in committed to do. He tried both. He tried to do both. I mentioned that he was elected overwhelmingly, 73% of the vote, a landslide vote. And over time, as happens with incumbent presidents, the ratings go down. It goes down. So I visited a bunch of times during that time, during that period, and was there, as I say, in 2019. I left in early 2020. I came back and visited a couple of times, but in January of 2022. Okay, so January of last year. The end of January of last year was about 3 weeks, we now know, didn't know then, but before the invasion, before the Russian invasion, the big Russian invasion. Not this small one that had happened in 2014, but we remember on the 24th of February last year, the Russians invaded with this overwhelming force. 3 weeks before that invasion, I was there, talked to President Zelensky again. Different man, obviously the same person, but in a different position, and much more grimmer. I mean, he was determined. He was not certainly not as idealistic, certainly not as naive. He had been briefed by our CIA to tell him, Mr. President, everybody could see, everybody in this room probably saw the pictures in the newspaper and on the TV of these Russian troops all the way around the borders. And so, Bill Burns, head of the CIA, director of CIA, had come to tell President Zelensky, we can all see the Russian troops on the border of Belarus, the Russian troops on the border of Russia, the Russian troops down here in Donbass, the Russian troops in Crimea, and all those troops, Bill Burns told President Zelensky, are very likely to invade. Now, President Zelensky, I'm going to violate the rule here when I get some water. President Zelensky knew the intelligence. He heard Bill Burns tell him what was likely to come. Our intelligence was actually pretty good on that aspect. Our intelligence was pretty good in that Bill Burns knew, the CIA knew, that Putin was very, very likely to invade. Very likely to invade. President Zelensky was not there yet. He saw what we all saw about the troops arrayed around his border. He heard the briefing, but he didn't believe, and a lot of people didn't believe, that Putin would actually do it, that he would actually do something to roll across the border with all these tanks, all these missiles, all this infantry, and invade Ukraine in a big way. He wasn't convinced. Zelensky was just not convinced that. He did take measures to prepare, as he should have, as you would expect. But he was not sure it was going to happen. And the French and the Germans were telling him, don't believe the Americans, don't believe the Americans. And the Russians were dismissive. The Russians were saying, invade? No, this is just a trial. This is an exercise. This is not something that we're not going to invade. They said that. They just lied directly to the world, and including to President Zelensky. Well, we know what happened. On the 24th of February, the Russians invaded. 4 a.m. They started bombing. They set their tanks across. Again, they came down from the north, from Belarus, and they were headed for Kyiv, the capital. This is where Zelensky was. Of course, he was in the capital. But they also came across this way from Russia. They came this way. They were coming down this way. This is down the river. You can't really see it here. But they also were coming up from this direction. And as I mentioned, they had these forces that I mentioned. They also came up and went both directions here. So the 24th of February, Zelensky goes into war mode. I mean, there were a lot of people around the world, many in the United States, many in Europe, thought there was no chance. Thought that Russia, overwhelmingly superior in forces, in population, in weapons, overwhelmingly, would just run over the Ukrainians. Well, turns out not. Turns out that the Russians tried to come down towards Kyiv. The goal was to capture Kyiv, find Zelensky, get rid of him somehow. If it took killing him, they were very ready to do that. They had hit squads in the city on that day, and take over the country. They wanted to take over, they wanted to take full control of Ukraine. Let me just say a little bit about why we think they were doing this. President Putin has this obsession, really. I've never met this man. I know some people who have, and I know some people who have studied him very carefully, and they will describe, many of us have read the analysis. Putin has this sense that he wants to be a great Russian leader. He wants to go down in history as a great Russian leader in the same category as Catherine the Great or Peter the Great. He wants to be Vladimir the Great. And in order to do that, he needs to control and bring back Ukraine into the empire, into what was the Soviet Union, back into his control. That's what his goal was. And so the goal then to the military was come down the river, come across this way, come this way, and try to take over the country. Putin thinks, just one more word on Putin. Putin thinks that Ukraine doesn't exist. There's not, in Putin's mind, there's no separate nation. There's no people, Ukraine. There are people he recognizes that live in this part of the world, near Russia, but he said those people, as far as Putin's concerned, not really Ukrainians. They're really just Russians that are confused, and he therefore wants to take them over. He wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. So that was the goal. Zelensky. Putting in place, he had put in place forces, had dispersed the forces. In particular, there's a base right here, an air base right here, and he'd moved the airplanes off of that, and he had put defensive measures and units, territorial defense units, in this area, and they started to slow down the attack. But in the first couple of days, the Russians were barreling down the river towards Kyiv. President Zelensky's staff, and probably some Americans, went into President Zelensky in the first 2 weeks of the war and said, Mr. President, we need you to lead this country. We need you to be able, we can't lose you. And we will help you keep alive, and we will help you get from Kyiv maybe to the southwestern part of the country, the Carpathian Mountains down here, pretty far away from all the different axes of advance by the Russians. And President Putin was on the way down. President Zelensky, when he heard these proposals, these ideas, suggestions, these offers to get him out of Kyiv, he said no. He said no. There's a famous line which you will recognize. He says, I need ammunition, not a ride. And he stayed. He stayed in Kyiv. And that endeared him to the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people, as I say, 3 weeks prior, when I was visiting him, his approval ratings, his support, were in the 30s. When he stayed in Kyiv, and day after day after day, he made these speeches. We've seen these speeches. Every day he would make these. He would go out. It wasn't in a bunker somewhere. He was in his office, and he would go out on the streets, and I've spent a lot of time on that street. There's some very noticeable architecture there. Again, people in this room will have visited Bankova, and he would take a selfie, and he would take a video, and he would show the Ukrainian people that he's there in Kyiv. He's not leaving. And they loved him. That courage, that endeared him to the Ukrainian people, and that bond goes both ways. He understands what Ukrainians want and need and demand for themselves and for their country, and they follow him. It is an incredible bond between Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. So that's how we. Not quite. There's a little bit more that happened on the first part, how we got here. So the Ukrainian military actually did an amazingly good job. The Russian military did an amazingly bad job. And the Ukrainian military pushed the Russians back into Belarus. We've seen these pictures. The Javelin anti-tank weapons that we provided, the Americans provided, very effective. And the Ukrainian military pushed the Russians back out. This is what we're seeing here today. I should make clear is of a couple of days ago. This map is of a couple of days ago, and what's in red is what the Russians now occupy today on the 1st of March. That's this area. About a month in to the war, so February, March into early April, the Russians had all of this area here. All of that was red, and the Ukrainians pushed them back out. This blue is not water, by the way. I don't know why they use blue, but this is a more recent Ukrainian offensive that pushed the Russians out of there, pushed them back into here. Another Ukrainian offensive down here pushed the Russians back across the river. And so the story of the war has been initial invasion on the 24th of February. Ukrainians heroically, there's no other word, heroically pushed the Russians back out and have basically fought to a standstill. Standstill is not even the right word. It's more of a slugfest going back and forth. The Russians are battering the Ukrainians are battering back, and it's stabilized along this line that we see here. It's stabilized along that line. It's not really stable because it's still fighting going back and forth, but it hasn't moved. It hasn't moved back and forth that much. Meters, kilometers at most is what's going on. Now, as I say, the Russian military has done very badly. Surprised a lot of people. So our intelligence got it right that the Russian military was about to invade, got it wrong that they were very good. They were not very good. The Ukrainians were much better than any of the intelligence had to do. The Russians not being able to win on the battlefield, indeed being pushed way back, as you can see here. They were on all of this area, and now they're just back onto this area, pushed way back. They took the fight then to civilian part of Ukraine. And since October, the Russians have been bombarding civilian targets, bombarding a lot of the western part and the northern, western, southern parts of Ukraine with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, aircraft, airstrikes coming out of the Black Sea, which is right down here. Coming out of Belarus, the aircraft fly. So they've been bombarding civilian targets, bombarding energy transmission, generation. And this, as I say, started in October. Those of you who raised your hands have been to Ukraine, it's cold. It is cold in the winter, and this was a calculated move by Putin's part and the Russian military to try to break the Ukrainians' will. By cutting off electricity. Electricity runs water pumps. So the water doesn't get up to the top of apartment buildings. So you have to walk down many floors and walk back up with water. It obviously affects heat and light and communications. This was what the intent was. This was as the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back out in this way and retook these towns right here, they were horrified at what they found. They found clear evidence of atrocities, clear evidence of mass graves, clear evidence of torture, of killing of people whose hands were bound behind their back, rapes, stealing of children and sending them into Russia, kidnapping children and sending them into Russian families to try to eliminate Ukraine. Again, the goal of Putin is to eliminate Ukraine. And so his soldiers did that. These atrocities were discovered in every town that the Russians had occupied in this area, in Kharkiv, in Kherson, in every town that was liberated by the Ukrainians that pushed the Russians out, found the same thing, atrocities. Okay, so that's the first part here. That's where we are. That's how we got here. Where we are today is that the Ukrainians and Zelensky are convinced that they can continue to win. That they are convinced that they can continue to push the Russians all the way out of their country. And the Ukrainians don't want to give up any of their territory. I mean, they know, we all know, we look at maps, every map in the world except in Russia will show Ukraine. And these are the borders. These are the borders, including Crimea, including Odessa, all the way up here. This is Moldova, this is not it, all the way here. The Ukrainians don't want to give up any of their territory. They know that Ukrainians who live in occupied territory are tortured or killed. They don't want their people, other Ukrainians, to go through the same thing. They have my message here is that the Ukrainians have a strong feeling about their country, and they want to defend it, and they want the Russians out of it, and they are defending this now. From the beginning, this is where we start to get the international role, our role. We've been supporting the Ukrainians very heavily, as we all read in the newspapers. It's been, I will give the Biden administration a lot of credit for pulling together the alliance, the NATO alliance, pulling together a broader coalition of the rest of Europe, of Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, pulling together very heavy sanctions on the Russians, pulling together very strong military support, weapons support for the Ukrainians to allow them to push the Russians back. And the question is, this is going to get into this next part of my discussion here, the question is, where does it go from here? Where does this war end up? How does this good. Just keep on time here. How does this end? And there are several ways that this could end. There are several scenarios for how the next phase plays out. Let me just do the two that I can see are these. That one's short, and I will tell you optimistic, and the Ukrainians win in this scenario. There's another one. There's another scenario that's longer. That's an extension of this slugfest or of this stalemate. And so those two, let me just describe those quickly. So how could this end quickly? I mentioned that the United States and the rest of NATO have provided weapons to the Ukrainians. If that continues, and indeed if it accelerates, if more weapons of higher distance, of greater weight, that is more capable weapons are come, then the Ukrainians can break through these lines. These lines are now pretty static, as I've mentioned. They're fighting back and forth. But if the Ukrainians could break through, in particular here, this is a body of water, Sea of Azov, and this is called the land bridge. The land bridge from Russia, this is Russia, through the occupied territories, down through Kherson into Crimea. That's the land bridge that they've used to supply themselves. And if the Ukrainians can break through from here with these new weapons and these new units that they're putting together, they could break this land bridge, and that would cut off Crimea, cut off the rest of Kherson. And what could happen, and I was in the military a long time ago, and so there are much smarter people about the military situation than I, and they will tell us that if there's a strike, if there is a breakthrough, if there is this Ukrainian push that breaks through the Russian forces, the Russians could crumble. The Russian military could crack. The Russian military is under a lot of pressure right now. We thought that they were this great military organization. Turns out not so much. It turns out that the troops are not real. The Russian troops are not sure why they're there. The Russian troop morale is so bad because Putin has tried to tell them why they're invading their neighbor. Most of the Russian troops and most of the civilians, Russian population, they don't have anything against the Ukrainians. They've been living by, Ukraine's been a free nation living on their border for 30 years, and before that they were all part of the Soviet Union together. So trying to tell the Russian soldiers why they're invading this neighboring country is hard, and the Russian morale is bad. The Russian equipment turns out to be pretty bad. The Russian leadership turns out to be pretty bad. Putin has changed the leadership, military leadership, every 3 months. When you're losing, you change your leadership. If you're winning, you stick with your leadership. So the Russian military is having a hard time, and it could crack with this breakthrough. And then President Putin, seeing he's likely to lose in this case, he might say, okay, actually, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about this. Maybe we'll talk about Crimea. Maybe we'll talk about whether NATO goes into Ukraine. There may be some things that Putin could talk about that he would try to spin into a victory somehow, or somehow he's not so bad, not really a defeat. But that is clearly a Ukrainian win. Ukrainians have a clear definition of victory. And it is the Russian troops out of their country. That's all they want. They want the Russian soldiers out of their country. They want all this to be white. They don't want this to be red any longer. They just want the Russian troops out. And they've said that part of that retaking of all this area can be militarily, and they're doing it militarily. They've already pushed them out of here and back into where they are now. So the military is part of that retaking of Ukrainian territory. But they've also said, Ukrainians have said, we can also take back some of that through diplomacy. We can have a conversation about this, and that might apply to Crimea. Crimea, again, the military people will tell us, hard to retake. Not impossible, but hard for the military to take. There's a little isthmus right here. It's only 5 miles wide, so to get a lot of tanks across that is real hard to do. The Ukrainians don't have airborne troops to fly in, to be parachuted in. They don't have amphibious troops to come from Odessa. So Crimea is a challenge, but the Ukrainians are determined that they're not giving up a square inch of Ukrainian territory, and so they're going to take it back one way or the other. The longer scenario, okay, so the short scenario, that could happen in 3 months. That could happen in this summer, and that would be a Ukrainian win with the Russians out. The longer scenario is an extension of what we're seeing right now. That is this slugfest. It may exhaust both sides so that neither side is able to break through. And in that case, and even in preparation for that case, some people have been urging President Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. See if you can't just offer him something that will make him stop fighting, will make Putin pull the troops out, or at least stop them from fighting. And there have been some proposals from some Americans, not in the government, but outside, but also from Europeans who want President Zelensky to negotiate and give up some territory, give up some part of Ukraine so that this war will end. Now here I will historical parallel. Many people have observed that Zelensky has rallied his people and has rallied the world. Many of us saw him addressing, he was here in December in Washington, addressing the Congress, meeting with President Biden. He's quite a speaker. He's very inspirational. He's inspired his country, he's inspired us, he's inspired the world to support him. For a year, when President Putin thought he was going to roll down into Kyiv in 3 days, President Zelensky has done an amazing job. People have observed that it's like Churchill. You know, he has mobilized the language, and he comes to Britain. He zooms into Britain, and his speech there, he remembers Churchill. He said, "We're going to fight on the beaches, and we're going to fight in the streets, and we're going to fight." So he tailors his speeches to the audience, of course. Same thing when he was here. He was asking for aircraft and he said, Americans remember being attacked from the sky. He said, you remember 9/11. He said, you remember Pearl Harbor. You remember those kind of things. So he's a very good communicator. He's an excellent communicator. And like Churchill, Zelensky's being pressured to negotiate with Putin. We may remember that Churchill was also pressured to negotiate with Hitler. In 1939, 1940, or before we entered the war, Winston Churchill was just in office, just became the prime minister, and Neville Chamberlain, his predecessor, and his foreign minister, Lord Halifax, said, you know, Mr. Prime Minister, you're about to lose the whole British army at Dunkirk. They're about to be pushed into the Channel. You have to negotiate with Hitler. And Churchill said no. Churchill said no. There are a lot of people telling Zelensky that he should negotiate with Putin, and he has said no. Putin is not going to bully him. Zelensky is not going to negotiate. In particular, when Putin is saying that Putin, owns some of this land. He says he owns the Crimea. He says he owns this part of Ukraine. There's no negotiations there. There's no negotiations there at this point. So just to review the bidding here, how are we doing here? Good. Got the last part. So how we got here, where we are today, how it might go, that is these two scenarios, we can talk about that. Why does this matter? Why do we care which scenario? Why do we care if Ukrainians win or if the Russians get pushed out? There are two kinds of reasons and again, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. One is the strategy, the global perspective. I mentioned earlier that from 1945 to 2014, when the Russians invaded, there were some rules of the road. There were some understandings, some principles that guided how nations dealt with each other. And, sovereignty, territorial integrity of your neighbors. Those were all violated. But if we're going to get back to that kind of a world where big nations don't invade small nations on their border, if we're going to get back to that kind of world from the second half of last century, we're going to have to get the Russians out of Ukraine, to reestablish that order, to reestablish those rules of how nations deal with each other. Before that, we had 2 world wars in the first half of last century, and that's when there were no rules. And that's when large powers invaded small powers, smaller countries. In the second half, there were these understandings, there were these principles, and they're in the UN Charter, and which the Soviets have signed, and the Russians have agreed to in the treaties that they've signed with the Russians before the invasion. So these principles of sovereignty of nations, of territorial integrity, of peaceful resolution of disputes, these are well established. To reestablish those has the potential to get us back to a world that is not the law of the jungle, like the first half, but is more the rule of some law, some order, like the second half of last century. That's kind of the big picture. That's the question of what kind of world do we want to live in, our kids to live in, our grandchildren to live in? Is it one like the first half or like the second half? There's another reason, I think, that Americans care, and it's a moral reason. It offends me. I get angry when I hear of the atrocities, when I hear of the intentional bombing of civilians, of schools and hospitals, maternity wards, when we see the evidence of war crimes. It's horrible. It is crimes of humanity against humanity, as the government, as the U.S. government has. It's probably genocide. I mentioned that President Putin wants to wipe out Ukraine. This is a moral offense. This is wrong. This is wrong, and we care about that, and we take action. We're going to take action to hold people accountable, but we also take action to help people who are in trouble, and we provide a lot of humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and the refugees that are out. So those two reasons, both the big picture of kind of a rules-based order, as well as this kind of moral imperative that we should not allow these kind of atrocities, these kind of crimes to be. So one last thing, and then I would love to. Then we'll open up for questions. And Chris has got yes, Chris has a mic. One last thing. Those two scenarios that I painted, that I described, one is a breakthrough by the Ukrainians and that ends the war quickly, maybe this summer, versus the longer term, drag out, stalemate that may lead. We can talk about where that kind of goes, but it's not resolved. A lot of that depends on us. A lot of what happens in each of those, whether or not this happens or that happens, will depend a lot on the United States and on the rest of NATO and the rest of this Western coalition, this coalition that the Biden administration has put together. Because the Ukrainians can win. They've shown that they can win. They can defeat the Russian military with our weapons, with our support. If our support flags, if our support reduces, if for reasons of politics or reasons of fatigue or reasons of our attention goes somewhere else, if that support is not maintained to the Ukrainians, they can't win. They can't go this short scenario. They're then pushed into this longer one, this longer scenario where they will never give up. They'll continue to fight. But if they don't have the support, they won't be able to push the Russians out of their country. Again, all Ukrainians want is to have the Russians out of their country, and that's what we're going to get. Okay, so we have a role here. We have a responsibility in this, is what I am. What I want to leave you with that part of it. And Chris has the mic, and I hope that something that I said prompted either disagreement or questions or whatever. But here we go.
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Ambassador
Yep.
Taylor. Let's give him a round of applause. I'm going to invite him.
I'm now allowed to move down
to this
here?
step, but just so he knows why I'm such a meanie, this is the good zone. The light is not washing out the projector. Now I'm in a place where the light is not washing out the projector, and now I'm in the projector. So there's actually logic to that. So, but now you can move here.
Now you move here. Okay, all right, very
So,
good, very good.
I will say this, please ask your questions, hold the mic like this, not like this, not like this. I'll tell you to move it closer because you can see what happens, okay? So really try to help us out with that. You have to get that very close. Raise your hand, I'll hand you the mic. Don't turn anything on, don't turn anything off, it will be live. Stand up to ask your question. And I say this all the time, we want to get to as many questions as possible, so if you can try to keep yours concise, Don't give us too much backstory, and make sure there's an actual question, okay? And I've instructed, and he knows this, he's a professional, at some point he may say, is there a question in that? So who's got the first question? Okay, we'll start here, and I'll just try to make my way around.
Sure. So you've been very clear that that the Ukrainians think that they can win the war if they have weapons. That would be the United States and NATO, right? So all along, the United States and NATO have been supplying weapons. They started out supplying weapons with capabilities that were small, and that has continued to grow. Can you talk about, I sort of want to hear about two issues. One is, can you describe how aligned NATO is with the United States? Because we're most interested in what the United States is going to do and what we think.
Yep.
Are the United States and NATO really aligned, or can you talk about disagreements within that group about, hey, just hand over the weapons and let them win? And can you also describe from there what the disagreements are within the United States about that issue?
Okay, good. And your name is?
I'm Kay.
Kay, thanks, Kay. Okay, good. Two good questions within both within NATO and within the United States. You're exactly right. We started off providing small weapons. We can even go back further. In 2014, up until about 2017, even 2018, we didn't provide any weapons that could kill people. That is, no lethal weapons. We provided some training and some humanitarian supplies, some non-lethal military equipment, communications gear, transportation. But finally we decided to provide these shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons called javelins. And that was not until like 2018. And the Biden administration came in and they've ratcheted up the, this is going to be part of your second question, have increased the weight, the range, the capability of these weapons, and we start off with these javelins. We're now up to what they call HIMARS, these rockets, rocket artillery that go a long distance and are very destructive. They're very precise, so they go right in on Russian military targets. We've done the same thing on anti-aircraft. We had this shoulder-fired Stingers, and now we're at that low-flying aircraft. The Stingers can shoot them down. We're now all the way up to Patriot missile system. This is the top of the line, anti-aircraft air defense. So we've gone up, but we haven't quite gotten to the long range that they need. So that's good. This is a preparation for both parts of your question. Within NATO, first of all, I served in NATO at the end of the Cold War, and when it was only 16 nations, and NATO decision-making has to be unanimous. Every one of the 16, now every one of the 30 have to agree, and they have. NATO has been more united in the last 12 months than I've ever seen, that anybody I've talked to has ever seen. So they've been united. There clearly have been, if you pointed to some, there have been some disagreements how quickly to provide these weapons. Tanks is a good example. For a long time, the United States said, we're not providing tanks. The Germans, who make a lot of the tanks that are in Europe right now, have said, nope, we're not providing tanks. And there was a debate. The Poles really want the Ukrainians to win, and they want the Ukrainians to get tanks for obvious reasons. If Ukraine falls, Russia's right on the Polish border. So the Poles and the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, the East Europeans are very strong on support for Ukraine. The rest of NATO is too, but you can see the distance matters on this thing. So there was an argument within NATO about tanks. Finally, the United States said, okay, if you're Germany not going to provide your tanks until the Americans provide it, we'll provide some. And we did. And the German tanks are now starting to arrive in country. They're starting to train on them. Let me get to your second part of your question, Kay, and that is within U.S. government, and indeed between the Congress and the administration, there have been disagreements. One of the disagreements within the government has been how quickly to move up the ladder. Again, from javelins all the way up to HIMARS, and from Stingers all the way up to Patriots, and from no tanks all the way up to our main battle tank, M1 Abrams. There was a debate, and is still a debate, how much to provide to the Ukrainians. There's still there's a couple of rungs above that, and still in the conventional weapons, obviously, we're talking about. And that debate, the Congress has been urging the administration to go faster, get up that ladder faster. There are people within the administration who want to go up that ladder faster. But it's a debate. I mean, there are probably a lot of people in this room who have spent time in the U.S. government or other governments and know how these decisions are made. It's a debate. And what we've seen so far is, in my view, them going in the right direction, making the decision to raise the quality and quantity of these weapons going forward. Thanks, Kay.
Yeah, very similar question to that.
And your name is?
Andy.
Andy, thank you, Andy. That
Yes.
helps.
Very similar to that question. Why is there the hesitancy with the U.S. and NATO to provide those additional capable weapons? What's the hesitancy? Why haven't we made that decision, 6 months ago?
So it's a very good question. One of the answers is, right at the beginning, I mentioned that we all thought the Russians were going to just barrel down the river, take Kyiv, we all thought that this was going to be over quickly. So in that situation, under those conditions, we were not, no one was ready to provide the weapons that certainly we're now providing to a country, a military that was likely to be overrun. We really thought, there were a lot of people, most people around the world thought that the Ukrainians were going to lose. When it became clear that the Ukrainians actually are going to put up a heck of a fight, and indeed are pushing the Russians back out of their country and back away from Kyiv and other big cities, other cities in the northeast, that changed, and we started to provide these weapons. So the first answer to your question was, we didn't think they would be able to use them because they would lose. Second one was, if we provide it to them and they're overrun, then the Russians get the technology. There was that question as well. I'll be frank, there are people who worry that every time that we give the Ukrainians a new weapon system, that's going to enrage the Russians and they're going to do something else, something to escalate. We can talk about that. I don't think that's the Russians have escalated. They have escalated. They came across the border. That's an escalation. They're now, mobilizing. The Russians are escalating in that regard. We want the Ukrainians, my view is we want the Ukrainians to win. There is a concern about this escalation question that has held things back. He's in charge. Oh, you've already, good.
He's on it. My name's Kelly.
Kelly.
I have a nonprofit, and we've been in and out of Ukraine for the last year.
Great.
So I really appreciate your presentation. My question to you is, I don't think people really recognize that on an individual basis, you can actually help. So we get requests every day from both civilian and military. Radios, you name it, daily. I try to problem solve. In your opinion or your experience, how can we continue to get people involved on a grassroots level? Like
Kelly,
keep the
I'm
interest
so
going?
glad you asked that question. I was hoping for that question. The kinds of things that you're doing are an example of what people can do. And there have been a whole lot of organizations, humanitarian organizations, service organizations, military support organizations that have popped up in the United States, but also around Europe, also in Ukraine. Ukrainian civil society, they call it. Ukrainian people have organized themselves to support their military, but to support their government. The Ukrainians are united like never before. And that has inspired people like you to put those together. And so what people can do is take that kind of action, join those kinds of organizations, and you can contribute. You can obviously contribute, and you contribute to Kelly's organization. The Ukrainians have put together, President Zelensky has pushed an organization, a fund that's called United 24. And so if you Google United 24, you can get on the site right away. It's very easy, he says, to make contributions. I've made a couple of contributions to it. And it's very transparent. You know, you can see where your money goes. The fact is, you have a choice. You can do humanitarian contributions. You can make contributions to the healthcare system, taking care of both people as well as soldiers. If you want to buy drones, you can put your money into drones. And he keeps you, Zelensky sends through his people accounting. So it's you know it's going to the where you sent it. Third thing, let your representatives in Washington know how you feel, one way or the other. I would hope you would let them know that there's a reason that we care about Ukraine, and there's a reason that we're providing this assistance. We want them to win for either this global order or because of our moral sense. And your Congress people need to hear that because, as I say, the determination between the short scenario and the longer grind with a lot of more people dying is our support. So our Congress needs to know how we feel. Well, this is what they do. And so those three things, I would say, are what we can do to get people involved.
Hi, I'd love to take the conversation just like a step back. So something that I'm a little worried about is, you know, like as the unified, quote unquote, like West, we're very focused on Ukraine, but there are other large countries that have territorial aspirations. You know, I'm thinking about like China would potentially want to take Taiwan. So with all the support that we're giving to Ukraine and all of like the emotional energy, like all the money we're pouring into Ukraine, do we have bandwidth to also protect Taiwan if something happens? Because it seems like this would be a strategic moment to...
Thank you. Great question. Your name is?
Tim.
Tim. Thank you, Tim. I was hoping we'd get the China question because this is an important one. And I think the answer is yes to your last question. I think we can do that. And furthermore, I think President Xi of China is watching very closely what happens to President Putin. I imagine that President Putin and President Xi are both really surprised at the response of the West to this invasion that the Russians are mounting against the Ukrainians. I'm sure Putin didn't expect that, and I'm sure President Xi was looking at that. The response of the West on the sanctions, President Putin didn't think he was going to be sanctioned, and the West has been very united and has put on sanctions harsher than on any nation. Any sanctions, no sanctions have been tougher on any nation in history. And President Xi knows that. He sees that. He says, oh, this can happen. That's number one. Number two, the Chinese are observing the Ukrainians as well, and the Chinese said, you know, we didn't think the Ukrainians were that tough. Maybe we should check to see how tough the Taiwanese are, and just be sure. And the Chinese are also taking a look and said, you know, we thought those Russian military were pretty good. It turns out they're not so. Maybe we should check the Chinese military as well. A lot of corruption in the Russian military, which causes this problem, and President Xi is probably concerned about that as well. The other thing is the ability for the United States to lead a coalition, to lead this alliance. I bet President Putin didn't think that was going to happen, and I bet President Xi also. Think of where it was when President Putin decided to invade. He looked at President Biden, not in office very long, certainly in the first part, but then he was only in office about a year, and you know we saw what happened in Afghanistan. It was not a great, you know, President Putin could have been forgiven for thinking that, you know, the Americans don't have the stomach. The Americans are not going to put up, not going to support the Ukrainians. President Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. He's not going to support Ukraine. It turns out differently. It turns out that that we do have the stomach to support. And I think President Xi is noticing that as well. So I think if we want to deter the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, we support Ukraine. Thanks, Tim. I'm glad you asked that. Who's got the next one? Yes, sir.
Right here. Let's say your first scenario.
Yes.
Let's say your first scenario, they crack through down to the Black Sea.
Yep.
The Russian army is defeated. With Putin with his back against the wall,
Yes.
and the Wagner group leader
Yep.
is putting pressure on him, what's the likelihood that Putin might use tactical nuclear
There's
weapons?
another great question. There's another great question, and I'm going to come to that nuclear question. I think, but just on the premise, this metaphor, this vision, this notion that President Putin's back against the wall. He's got 11 time zones. His back is not up against the wall. He can stop this tomorrow. He lived with an independent Ukraine for 30 years, 31 years. He lived sharing Sevastopol down in Crimea with the Ukrainians for 31 years. So I dispute the notion that he has no choice, or he's up against the wall. He's in a corner. But your question is still a very good one. Because President Putin has said, I've got nuclear weapons. As if we may have forgotten that he had nuclear weapons. And he's using that, obviously, earlier on to try to deter some of these things that we were just talking about, what Kay was asking about what kind of weapons we provide to the Ukrainians. And when he rattles this nuclear saber, he wants to intimidate us from supporting the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have called his bluff, and we've called his bluff each time. And he has not used this. Now, we have to prepare, we have to be ready if he does, because he does have nuclear weapons. He has said he's going to use it. But I think the chances are very, very low. Smarter people than I am, who study this more than I have, and who know the Russians better than I, agree that the chances are very low. Why? First of all, there's no military benefit for him to use a nuclear weapon anywhere close to his own troops on a Ukrainian formation. There's no big Ukrainian military formations. They're dispersed. So there's no military benefit to this, and it wipes out. It makes that part of the battlefield uninhabitable, so you can't move. There's no military reason to do that. Even more important than that, though, is, and going back to Tim's question about China, President Xi has been very clear with President Putin himself about knock off this rhetoric about using nuclear weapons. The Chinese do not want to see nuclear weapons used. No one wants to see nuclear weapons used, and they don't want to hear this irresponsible talk about I might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So the political, both domestic political response as well as the international political response would be devastating if he were to make that decision. One last thing, and that is, we deter the use of nuclear weapons when we're talking about the strategic realm. There's a deterrence going on here as well. The United States has said out loud, but also has said in private to the Russians, don't use nuclear weapons. Don't even think about using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, because if you do, there will be, and this is what they've said out loud, catastrophic consequences. Catastrophic. So the Russians need to know, Putin needs to know, that there would be grave damage to his military capacity, his military capabilities, if he were to use that. Because the catastrophic consequences that Jake Sullivan has said out loud and President Biden has made clear would not be nuclear. In my view, again, in the very low probability that that the Russians would use nuclear weapons in, we would not respond. We'd have to respond somehow, but we wouldn't respond with nuclear weapons. We wouldn't shoot back a nuclear weapon. We would respond probably with a devastating attack on the Russian military unit that fired that weapon. That would be a response. I don't know what it would be. They're smarter people than I am in the Pentagon who are figuring this out, but there needs to be a deterrent to him making that decision. He's deterred by the Chinese, he's deterred by the international community, he's deterred by the military who say, there's no benefit to this, I think the chances are very low.
I'm going to ask the next question from the balcony.
The balcony. Can you hear in the balcony? Okay.
So this is from Kelly, and it's a two-part question. So she wants to know, why did he invade Crimea first, back in 2014? What was the plan? Was it part of a bigger plan? Why did he wait 8 years before the next attack?
So President Putin has wanted to control Ukraine somehow. And the reason he invaded Crimea back in 2014 was in response to a failed attempt to control Ukraine. I mentioned that the Russian-leaning president of Ukraine, this guy Yanukovych, elected in 2010, served until 2014, when all these things happened, when the Russians invaded. Yanukovych gave Putin some reason to think that there would be some control, that Putin would have some control over Ukraine because he had control. He could bribe Yanukovych. Indeed, did bribe Yanukovych when Yanukovych was about to go sign up with the EU. He was about to sign an association agreement with the European Union, and President Putin, woke up and said, "Oh my golly, if that happens, then my goal of reconquering, retaking, reabsorbing Ukraine will be forever lost. So I can't let that happen." So he bribed $15 billion he offered to Yanukovych to turn around, and low gas prices. And Yanukovych said, "Sounds good to me." And so he turned around, didn't sign with and that set the Ukrainians into the street in 2014. 2013 and 2014, in the Revolution of Dignity, and they then ran Yanukovych out of the country. He's now in Russia. Why? And getting to the question, and when Yanukovych runs off, abandoned ship. He was the president. He left the country, escaped to Russia. Putin realized that he was in real trouble. Now, how is he going to control Ukraine without that lever? So he invades. Yeah, he invades. He invades first Crimea, and then Donbass. And there's only about a couple of months between Crimea and Donbass. And what he hoped was that this would give him the leverage if he controlled Crimea and controlled Donbass. He hoped to have leverage with the government in Kyiv, with the overall Ukrainian government, again to be able to control their foreign policy and to be able to control Ukraine. And he entered into these negotiations, they're called the Minsk negotiations, that didn't go anywhere, but he thought through these negotiations he could get control. And when it turned out, then this gets to the last part of the question, it turned out that didn't work. The Ukrainians were not buying this Minsk negotiation. He had to go big, and then he decided the 24th of February, and then he invaded because he said, I've tried through a friendly dictator down in Ukraine, Yanukovych, didn't work. I've tried by trying to control part of Ukraine, invading them, only controlling part, that didn't work. Now I have to go big, he was saying, and that's why he went in there. I hope that answers that question.
He had some other invasions in there too, right?
There were some.
Other countries?
Well, he's right. Well, you're exactly right. He invaded Georgia in 2008.
Oh.
In 2008, he invaded Georgia. That's an interesting story too. So there was a NATO summit in 2008, and then President Bush wanted to try to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, or at least get them on the road to NATO. And actually, President Bush came to Kyiv. I was ambassador at the time, and he came to Kyiv, visited, talked to the Ukrainians about getting into NATO, because he was going from Kyiv to the summit, this NATO summit in Bucharest, where all the NATO leaders were there. And President Bush came in with a strong argument, just was in Kyiv. The Germans and the French didn't buy it. They didn't say yes to a membership for Ukraine and Georgia. And 3 months later, Putin, noticing that, invades Georgia. 6 years later, when nothing much happened after his invasion of Georgia, he still occupies part of Georgia today, he invades Ukraine and Crimea. So this is what happens when you allow him to move forward. Yes, ma'am.
You cannot imagine how grateful we are for your presence tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad to be
Yeah.
here.
A couple of questions, quick ones. What is your personal view of the likelihood of the short term versus the long term? Could you give us percentages? Number one.
Well, your name is?
Rebecca.
Rebecca. Okay, this is a hard question. Right, exactly. All right.
Secondly, we hear across the media that, quote, the Russian troops are disillusioned. That's quite a generalization they make. Do we have a real basis for making those claims? And lastly, if you'd care to comment on Iran's involvement, that might be interesting to talk about.
Okay, let me see if I got this here. That's right.
And make them quick.
See, going backwards. So Iran, right. Okay, the percentages. Let me preface this that when I was asked on one of the Sunday shows before the invasion, so I was asked this question about are they going to invade, and I didn't want to say yes or no, and I wanted to do what you just asked, and that is probabilities. And so this is to tell you that my probabilities are not so good because I said 55-45 against an invasion. Okay, so I was, and people said, well, he predicted they wouldn't invade. Well, no, it was 45% chance of invading. That's still a lot, but that didn't satisfy people. So I will try a percentage. I think there is a 25% chance of a breakthrough. This assumes, though, that we continue to provide these weapons. The Ukrainians are very good. They've got very good generals, and they, I could be all wrong. I mean, they may go somewhere else. I talked about this breakthrough down to the Sea of Azov, but they may go north. They faked them before. That's how they did so well in the northern part the first time, because they said they were going to go. So I don't know how it's going to happen. I would say that, and then I would say, there's a bigger chance, a greater chance for the grind, for the turmoil. Okay, and then the soldiers, the Russians. How do we know? We don't know, but there have been Russian soldiers captured. And the Ukrainians don't kill them, they capture them, they get information from them. Some of the information is on their morale. There was, just today, the New York Times just had a great article today on March 1st about a big tank battle. The biggest tank battle in the war that the Ukrainians won decisively. And part of that win was captured soldiers. And one of the reasons that the Russians did so badly in this battle, like in previous battles, is that they're not trained. They were thrown into this. They barely knew how to run these tanks, much less fire them very effectively. And other interviews. I think it was the New York Times as well had a long interview about 3 or 4 of these Russians. Oh, they were Wagner. From the Wagner private military company, headed up by this Prigozhin. And these Wagner soldiers, again, they're not in the Russian military, they're a private firm, but they are fighting as mercenaries. I think it was the Washington Post did a long interview with these people, with the Ukrainians standing right there, with these Russian soldiers, and they said the same thing. These were prisoners, actually. So the Wagner, for a while, trying to get more soldiers to send in to fight in Ukraine, went to Russian jails, Russian prisons, and said, look, if you will volunteer to fight in Ukraine, we'll let you out of jail. And a lot of them died. And they're letting their colleagues know, don't come. This is a loser. Okay, and then Iran. So the only thing I'll say on Iran is that they are clearly supporting the Russians, and they're providing these drones, and maybe more than just drones. The Russians, in return, are providing, we hear, aircraft and missile technology. The question I've got is, if the Iranians are helping the Russians, And the Iranians are the arch enemy of the Israelis. Why aren't the Israelis supporting the Ukrainians? And maybe they will, maybe when this dawns on them. But that is a mystery. That's a hard one to understand. Sir.
Gregory,
Thank you.
there's a lot of narrative to this question, but I am going to get to it.
Okay.
Is Vladimir Putin prepared to die for his obsession? He's not a dictator of 20 years. People don't say no. And he wants to recreate the Russian Empire.
Right.
And he wants to create a legacy. We're not sending aircraft because we're worried that he might be willing to die for this picture. And tactical nukes, I don't think are anywhere near as low in probability because he cannot be humiliated. I don't think he can stand for that. What is the opinion of the smart people as to his state of mind?
Smarter people than I, Gregory. No, you're right. You're very right that there are smarter people than I on this question. And on Putin, is he willing to die? I don't think so. I don't think he's crazy. I don't think he is suicidal. I think the first part of what you said, he does want to recreate the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, and he wants to go down in history as a great Russian leader, and that's what he cares about. If he can get it some other way, you're right. It's hard to imagine him saying, "Actually, I've lost on the battlefield." It's hard to imagine. But it could happen. We can try to imagine it. And if we think that he's not suicidal, and that he has got total control over the message, total control over the information that all Russians get, there's a way that he could stay in office. I think. I don't think it's existential for him, and which makes me think that the odds are low. Now, I know that there are other people in this room, because I talked to one of them today, he gave me a ride, who are sure that you're right, that is, there's a higher probability of nuclear weapons. We have to be prepared, because it is possible, the chances are not zero, so we have to be prepared, and we are doing things to prepare the Ukrainians. We have to be prepared to follow through on our threat of catastrophic consequences if they use these in Ukraine. But I still think the odds are low. Thanks, Gregory.
Let's give him another big round of applause.